detail. "I also killed those kids last year." In that single sentence, the shooter linked the Blue Rock Springs attack to the murders at Lake Herman Road. This was not a random robbery or a crime of passion. It was the first unmistakable sign of a killer who wanted the police to know exactly what he had done. On July 31, 1969, 3 identical letters arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. The writer did not wait for investigators to profile him or give him a moniker. Instead, he took control of his own narrative. Across these pages, he introduced a cold geometric signature, a cross drawn inside a circle. This simple symbol, stamped on his correspondence, became his repeated signature. In these letters, he claimed the name Zodiac. By christening himself, he transformed a series of localized regional homicides into an ongoing, interactive spectacle. The letters were no longer just communications about the crimes, they were the crimes themselves, played out on the front pages. The public now had a terrifying, self-styled persona to follow, a phantom identity that filled the vacuum left by the lack of a physical suspect. The myth of the Zodiac had officially begun. Along with the letters, the killer had sent a 3-part, 408-character cryptogram. He claimed this code would reveal his true identity, turning the hunt into a race against time. But as days passed, professional code breakers hit a wall. The breakthrough came not from a government lab, but from a living room in Salinas, California. Donald Gene Harden, a high school teacher, and his wife, Betty June, took up the challenge. They spent 4 days of intensive labor over their dining table using simple pencil and paper. By applying homophonic substitution and looking for common words like killing and forest, they cracked the code. At 6:35 p.m. on August 8, 1969, they delivered their solved worksheets to the San Francisco Chronicle. The public expected a name. Instead, they got a window into pure malice. The decoded message began, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." The rambling text offered no identity, ending with the boast, "I will not give you my name." For Vallejo Detective Sergeant John Lynch, the solution was a profound disappointment. It offered only the killer's bragging. The first major breakthrough had succeeded only in giving the phantom a voice. He had not unmasked himself. He had simply claimed his stage. On a warm Saturday afternoon, September 27, 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard drove to a quiet peninsula on the shores of Lake Berryessa. They wanted a peaceful picnic, a brief escape from classes. But the tranquility ended when a figure stepped out from the trees. He wore a heavy black hood, styled like an executioner's mask, with the cross-circle symbol stitched in white over his chest. In his hand, he held a long knife and pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline. By abandoning his firearm for a blade, the killer changed his method from distant to intimate, bringing a new level of unpredictability to the terror. He bound their hands, then attacked them both. Brian Hartnell survived multiple stab wounds, but Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later from her injuries. Before fleeing into the Napa twilight, the killer walked to Hartnell's white car door. Using a black felt-tip marker, he drew his signature cross circle. Underneath, he listed his history, the dates of the December and July attacks, followed by the day's date, the time, and a final chilling phrase, "by knife." He had stepped out of the dark to compile a physical index of his crimes, claiming ownership of his path in broad daylight. On the cool night of October 11, 1969, the killer abandoned rural roads and entered the heart of San Francisco. At 9:40 p.m., 29-year-old taxi driver Paul Stein picked up a passenger who directed him to the upscale neighborhood of Presidio Heights. At the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger fired a single shot into Stein's head, took his wallet and keys, and tore away a piece of his blood-stained shirt before vanishing into the darkness. 3 teenage witnesses watched the man escape from a window across the street. They immediately called the police, describing a white male suspect. But in the chaotic transmission to Central Dispatch, a devastating error occurred. The radio broadcast warned patrol units to search for a black male. This mistake had immediate, catastrophic consequences. Patrol officers Donald Fook and Eric Zelms, driving blocks away, actually stopped a white man matching the teenager's description. Because of the incorrect radio alert, they let him walk. The killer later mailed a piece of Stein's bloody shirt to the San Francisco Chronicle, explicitly mocking the police for their goof. Paul Stein would be the final confirmed victim, but this urban strike showed the killer could adapt his methods to any environment, while a single communication failure allowed him to escape forever. The hunt for the killer was no longer a standard homicide investigation. It was a sprawling bureaucratic puzzle. Because the crimes occurred across county lines, the case was fractured among the Vallejo Police Department, the Napa County Sheriff's Office, and the San Francisco Police Department. Files were scattered, evidence was shared slowly, and no single agency held total control. Into this chaotic vacuum stepped San Francisco Homicide Inspector Dave Toschi, a detective whose upside-down shoulder holster and intense style quickly made him the public face of the manhunt. But as detectives chased dead ends, a different kind of investigation took shape inside the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle. A young political cartoonist named Robert Graysmith became consumed by the case, collecting every letter, scrap of evidence, and police lead. The press had transitioned from reporting the news to actively participating in it, printing the killer's demands and feeding a growing public fascination. With every published letter, the real-world killer began to fade, replaced by a self-perpetuating myth that outgrew the active police files. Of the thousands of tips that flooded police departments, one name repeatedly cut through the noise: Arthur Lee Allen. A former elementary school teacher and convicted child molester, Allen first drew police attention in 1971. The circumstantial overlap was striking. He wore a Seawolf wristwatch, the very brand whose cross-circle logo matched the Zodiac signature. He owned a windbreaker similar to the one seen at Lake Berryessa, drove a car matching suspect descriptions, and lived near the site of the first attacks. In 1979, he failed a polygraph test when questioned about the letters. To many investigators, and later to the public, the puzzle pieces seemed to fit perfectly, but a criminal case is built on proof, not coincidence, and the case against Allen fractured under close examination. Surviving victim Michael Mageau pointed to Allen's photo in a lineup, but other witness statements created sharp contradictions. Kathleen Johns, who escaped a late-night abduction, described her attacker as a black male, whereas Allen was white. The physical evidence repeatedly failed to connect. Experts analyzed Allen's handwriting against the killer's letters and found no match. His fingerprints and palm prints did not match the latent prints lifted from the taxicab or the envelopes. Decades later, when scientists extracted touch DNA from the stamps, Allen's genetic profile was entirely excluded. Without a direct physical link, prosecutors could not establish a provable chain of evidence. Despite executing multiple search warrants on Allen's home, police never found a matching weapon or direct forensic tie. Other names frequently surfaced in the media, men like Richard Gaikowski, Lawrence Kane, and Don Chaney, but these served more as fuel for public obsession than as viable leads. No one was ever charged. Arthur Lee Allen died in 1992, taking whatever secrets he held to his grave. The suspect who dominated the public imagination remained, in the eyes of the law, an innocent man. In December 2020, 51 years after it was mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Zodiac's most notorious puzzle finally broke. An international team of amateur codebreakers, David Aranchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl van Eyck, cracked the 340-character cipher known as Z340. They did not use secret government mainframes. They applied modern crowdsourced pattern analysis and a custom decryption program called AZ-Decrypt, processing hundreds of thousands of grid permutations. The FBI officially validated the solution, but the breakthrough offered frustration rather than answers. The decoded text revealed no name. Instead, it only rebroadcast the killer's chilling, boastful voice, declaring that he was not afraid of the gas chamber because it would send him to paradise. While the cipher fell to computational mathematics, detectives turned to molecular biology. Vallejo investigators sent original mailings to forensic labs for advanced touch DNA testing, searching for microscopic skin cells and saliva traces left on stamps and envelope flaps. These techniques fundamentally changed what investigators could extract from half-century-old evidence, sparking a dramatic cycle of public breakthroughs and disputed claims. In 2021, an independent group called the Casebreakers pointed to a deceased Air Force veteran named Gary Post, claiming they had linked him to a partial DNA profile. But federal authorities quickly intervened, emphasizing that the case remained open. The DNA samples were highly degraded, and the claim was unverified. The investigative field is now split between verified scientific milestones, highly disputed theories, and outright speculation. Modern developments have successfully dismantled the killer's codes and isolated fragments of genetic material. Yet the physical identity of the Zodiac remains as elusive as it was in 1969. Decades later, the empty chairs at the victims' tables remain. The Zodiac transitioned from a flesh and blood killer into a permanent cultural ghost, escaping justice, but never our collective obsession. He wanted to be immortalized, but we must remember the lives he stole. If this journey stayed with you, please like the video. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. This documentary is based on publicly available historical records, official investigations, and credible reporting. Some details remain disputed. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a late-night safety test. But the disaster was not caused by one single mistake. It was the final result of a chain of decisions, design flaws, misunderstood reactor behavior, and a system that had given the people inside the control room very little room for error. To understand what went wrong, we have to look at what was supposed to go right. The test scheduled for reactor number 4 on April 25, 1986 was designed to solve a dangerous safety gap. If the external power grid ever failed, the station's emergency diesel generators would take about 50 seconds to start up. In a high-power nuclear reactor, 50 seconds without cooling water can easily lead to a core meltdown. Plant designers wanted to prove that the spinning, kinetic momentum of a coasting turbine generator could bridge this window, generating enough electricity to keep the vital water pumps running until backup power came online. Since the reactor was already scheduled for a routine maintenance shutdown, managers decided to run this experiment during the power descent. But unexpected grid demands delayed the test for 9 hours, pushing the execution deep into the night. At 11:10 p.m., the day shift handed operations over to the night crew, led by Supervisor Alexander Akimov and Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. This incoming team was expected to execute a highly specialized safety test, yet they had never received formal written instructions or proper training for this scenario. Instead, they had to rely on a draft procedure, stepping into a complex operation with a plan that was still being written as they went. At 1:06 a.m. on April 25th, operators began lowering the reactor's thermal output from its normal 3,200 megawatts down to 1,600 megawatts. They were preparing for the shutdown test. But at 1:05 p.m., the Kiev grid dispatcher intervened. Another regional power station had unexpectedly tripped, and the grid needed Chernobyl's electricity. Reactor 4 was forced to remain at half power, holding at 1,600 megawatts for the next 9 hours. This administrative delay did more than just push the test into the dead of night. It triggered an invisible chemical trap deep inside the core. Under normal high-power operation, a highly potent neutron-absorbing isotope called xenon-135 is constantly produced as a byproduct of fission, but it is quickly burned away by the intense neutron flux. Running at half power for 9 hours disrupted this balance, allowing a massive reservoir of xenon-135 to build up in the fuel. When the grid dispatcher finally cleared the plant to resume the power reduction at 11:10 p.m., the incoming crew aimed to stabilize the reactor at 1,000 megawatts. But as they lowered the power, the neutron flux dropped even further. The accumulated xenon could no longer transmute into stable xenon-136. Instead, this nuclear poison acted like a wet blanket over a fire, aggressively choking off the chain reaction. The reactor's output began to slip away from the operators. At 12:28 a.m. on April 26th, the thermal power collapsed entirely, cratering to just 30 megawatts. The power collapse to 30 megawatts should have ended the test. Under standard safety regulations, a drop of this magnitude required a complete shutdown of the reactor. But the pressure on the night shift was intense. Aborting the test meant delaying a highly anticipated safety demonstration, disrupting schedules, and answering to demanding managers who expected results. Instead of shutting down, the operators made the choice to restore power. Shift supervisor Alexander Akimov and operator Leonid Toptanov began manually withdrawing the boron carbide control rods from the core, pulling them out to allow the fission reaction to expand. By 1 a.m., they managed to stabilize the thermal output at roughly 200 megawatts. But the cost of this recovery was extreme. To keep the reactor running, the crew had withdrawn almost all of the control rods, leaving only 6 to 8 active inside the core. The plant's strict safety guidelines required a minimum operating reactivity margin of at least 15 effective rods to maintain control at all times. By continuing, the crew had pushed the reactor into a forbidden low-power range, operating far below the safe limit of 700 megawatts. They were now running a highly unstable machine with almost no mechanical brakes left to stop a sudden power surge. Inside the RBM K1000 core, solid graphite blocks act as the moderator, slowing down neutrons to sustain the nuclear chain reaction. To carry away heat, ordinary light water circulates through the fuel channels. But this water does double duty. It also acts as a neutron absorber, dampening the reaction. When the reactor operates under these specific conditions, the water begins to boil, creating pockets of steam, or voids. Unlike liquid water, steam cannot effectively absorb neutrons. Because the solid graphite remains in place, neutrons continue to be moderated, but there is no longer enough liquid water to absorb them. This causes the nuclear reaction to accelerate. This physical relationship is known as the positive void coefficient. In simple terms, it means that as liquid water turns to steam, the reactor's power increases. It creates a self-reinforcing loop. More heat produces more steam, which increases power, which in turn generates even more heat. Instead of naturally stabilizing, the reactor begins to run away, transforming what should be a cooling system into an engine for rapid, uncontrolled escalation. Operating an RBMK reactor below 700 megawatts thermal was strictly prohibited by Soviet safety regulations. It was a well-defined boundary designed to keep operators out of a physical danger zone. The problem lay deep within the reactor's massive core geometry, which was unusually tall and narrow. At high power, the entire core behaved predictably as a single system. But at low power, the neutron flux could tilt, effectively splitting the core into independent, unstable zones. One pocket of the reactor could experience a rapid increase in fission, while another remained quiet. This extreme spatial instability meant that the core became highly sensitive to even the smallest localized reactivity changes. In this forbidden low-power region, the physics of the machine became chaotic, completely eroding the reactor's inherent safety margins. The operators were no longer driving a stable, self-regulating machine. They had entered a realm where the reactor's physical design provided no defensive cushion, leaving them highly vulnerable to any sudden, localized shift in power. The physical construction of the RBMK-1000's control rods contained a hidden vulnerability that would only reveal itself under these low-power conditions. To control the nuclear chain reaction, the reactor relied on 211 control rods. The primary function of these rods was to absorb neutrons and slow down fission. For this reason, the main body of each rod was made of boron carbide, a highly effective neutron absorber. But the way these rods were assembled introduced a dangerous complication. Because the reactor core was exceptionally tall, designers wanted to make sure that when a control rod was fully withdrawn, water did not fill the empty channel and absorb too many neutrons. To prevent this, engineers attached a 5-meter-long graphite block, known as a displacer, to the bottom of each boron carbide rod. Under normal operations, this setup worked well. When a rod was fully withdrawn, the graphite displacer sat directly inside the core, replacing water and helping to keep the reactor running efficiently. But this meant that when the emergency shutdown button, known as AZ5, was pressed, the rods had to travel a long distance downward. As the rods began their descent, the graphite displacers entered the lower part of the core first, before the boron carbide absorbers could reach the fuel. For the first 1 to 2 seconds of insertion, this graphite displaced the water at the bottom of the channels. Since graphite is an excellent moderator and water is a mild absorber, this movement temporarily increased the rate of fission in the lower core. During standard high-power operation, this brief spike in reactivity lasted only a moment and was harmless. But in an unstable, xenon-poisoned reactor operating far below safe limits, this design characteristic would behave very differently. At 1:03, the crew shut down the automatic emergency core cooling system. They closed the isolation valves to prevent a sudden flood of cold water from thermal shocking the reactor, which they feared would disrupt the turbine rundown measurements. While standard for this specific test protocol, this decision turned off the plant's primary safety net. Next, operators bypassed the automatic shutdown triggers linked to the steam valves and turbine status, switching the automatic regulator to manual control. This meant the reactor would no longer scram on its own if the turbines stopped spinning. The operators wanted to prevent premature trips from interrupting their window of observation, but their actions dismantled the passive defenses of the RBMK. By disabling these automatic safety loops, the crew removed the active safeguards that could have overridden manual control. They were now operating a highly temperamental machine without its automatic emergency brakes, relying entirely on manual instruments and human reflexes to detect a runaway reaction before it was too late. Behind these choices lay a rigid decision-making environment. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov operated under intense institutional pressure to complete this long-delayed test. In the Soviet industrial system, failing to deliver results or delaying schedules carried severe professional consequences. This administrative environment prioritized production over safety, leading Dyatlov to repeatedly order the night crew to continue even as the reactor resisted their efforts. The operators themselves lacked the engineering knowledge to recognize the danger. Their training had not prepared them for low-power operations, and they had no access to simulation tools to model the core's erratic behavior. Specific physical realities remained hidden from them. The Soviet scientific establishment had never informed its reactor operators about the positive void coefficient or the graphite tip scram effect. The crew believed they were managing a stubborn, underpowered machine. They did not know that their training, their documentation, and the culture of secrecy had left them entirely defenseless. At exactly 1:23:04 on the morning of April 26th, the turbine rundown test began. The operators closed the emergency valves, cutting the flow of steam to the turbine generator. As the massive turbine began to coast down, the power supply to the main circulation pump started to drop. This slowed the flow of cooling water through the reactor core. With less water passing through the fuel channels, the heat quickly turned the remaining liquid into steam. These newly formed steam voids stopped absorbing neutrons. Because of the positive void coefficient, the fission rate began to climb, causing the reactor's thermal power to drift upward. At 1:23:40, shift supervisor Alexander Akimov decided to stop the test and stabilize the core. He ordered the activation of the AZ-5 emergency shutdown. Leonid Toptanov pressed the button, sending the 211 control rods descending into the core. But the reactor was already in an extremely unstable, highly voided state. As the control rods entered the core, their 5-meter graphite displacers went in first, momentarily displacing water at the bottom of the fuel channels. This triggered a massive, localized reactivity spike in the lower half of the core. The thermal power surged from 200 megawatts to an estimated 30 gigawatts, nearly 10 times the reactor's design capacity. The intense heat instantly vaporized the remaining coolant, generating a massive pressure front that ruptured the zirconium fuel channels. At approximately 1:23:45, a violent steam explosion blasted off the 1,000-ton upper biological shield, tearing through the roof of the reactor hull. Seconds later, a second, even larger explosion destroyed the building entirely, ejecting burning graphite and highly radioactive fuel into the night sky. The double blast instantly ruptured the reactor's pressure tubes, shattering the core's internal structure. The physical force of the steam expansion hurled the 1,000-ton upper biological shield, an immense steel lid codenamed Elena, completely sideways, leaving it wedged at a steep angle over the ruined reactor well. Because Reactor 4 was housed in a standard industrial hall rather than a steel-reinforced containment dome common in Western plants, there was no secondary protective barrier to hold the debris inside. Burning graphite blocks and highly radioactive fission products escaped directly into the open air, carried upward by a rising thermal plume. Yet, inside the control room, the crew remained almost entirely blind to the destruction. The shockwave shattered windows and shook loose plaster from the ceiling, but the instruments they relied on to monitor the core were either destroyed or frozen. Radiation meters pegged at their maximum limits or failed completely, while water flow indicators showed dead dials. To shift supervisor Alexander Akimov and deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, an exploded reactor was physically impossible under Soviet physics. They assumed the damage came from a localized steam explosion in the cooling tanks, convinced the core remained intact. This fatal misconception would dictate every decision made over the next few hours, leaving them struggling to grasp that Reactor 4 had already ceased to exist. At 1:28 a.m. on the morning of April 26, just 5 minutes after the twin explosions tore through Reactor 4, the first regional firefighters arrived at the scene. They found a conventional battleground. The roof of the turbine hall was ablaze, threatening to spread to the adjacent Reactor 3. This was a hazard they knew how to fight. What they did not know, and what their standard canvas gear offered no protection against, was that they were stepping into an invisible, lethal field of ionizing radiation. Among the early responders was Pripyat firefighter Petro Shavry. Like his colleagues, Shavry had never received training on radiological hazards. To these men, the immediate task was simple: contain the flames. They climbed ladders, hauled heavy hoses, and walked directly onto the ruined roof of the reactor building, surrounded by scattered blocks of burning graphite. Inside the plant, surviving operators and engineers struggled alongside the firefighters. These workers were not mythical caricatures or disposable volunteers. They were ordinary employees attempting to secure their workplace under impossible conditions. Many stayed at their posts to pump cooling water into what they believed was a damaged but intact reactor core, unaware that the core was completely gone. Within hours, the physical toll of this silent hazard became undeniable. By the end of the first day, 132 workers and firefighters were admitted to the Pripyat hospital showing severe symptoms of acute radiation sickness. Out of the 600 people present at the site during the initial response, 134 would eventually be diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome. For 28 of them, the exposures would prove fatal within the next 3 months. While hospital wards in Pripyat filled with injured responders, life in the city just 3 kilometers away proceeded as if nothing had happened. Saturday, April 26th, opened as a warm spring day. Children walked to school for morning classes. Shoppers queued outside grocery stores, and couples prepared for weekend weddings. From concrete apartment balconies, laundry hung out to dry in the gentle breeze. On the streets, some residents noticed a metallic taste in their mouths and a dry irritation in their throats. But without any timely warning from plant management or municipal leaders, there was no reason to suspect danger. Local police officers had blocked the roads leading out of the city early that morning. Yet they stood at their checkpoints without protective gear, telling inquiring citizens that the closures were part of a routine drill. Residents breathed the air, gathered in public parks, and watched a distant column of smoke rise from the horizon, completely unaware that invisible particles of iodine and cesium were settling over their skin, clothes, and gardens. Official evacuation records and personal accounts document a community continuing its weekend routines in absolute silence. Throughout the first 36 hours after the explosion, the people of Pripyat lived under a cloud of incomplete information, their daily lives progressing normally while a silent crisis expanded around them. While the Soviet state worked to keep the disaster contained within its administrative borders, the laws of physics ignored geopolitical boundaries. On the morning of April 28th, more than 1,200 kilometers away in Sweden, automated radiation monitors at the Forsmark nuclear power plant triggered an alarm. Workers there initially feared a leak inside their own facility, but manual checks quickly revealed that the radioactive particles settling on their boots had been carried by atmospheric winds from the east. The Swedish detection shattered the domestic monopoly on information. It exposed the massive scale of the atmospheric release to the global community, leaving Soviet authorities with no way to deny that something had gone catastrophically wrong. When Swedish officials contacted Moscow demanding an immediate explanation, the Soviet government was forced to acknowledge the event. Yet, the subsequent response remained heavily managed. On the evening of April 28th, the state television program Vremya broadcast a terse, 4-sentence announcement. An accident had occurred, a reactor was damaged, and measures were being taken. This minimal disclosure did more than just delay international cooperation. It severely restricted what local populations and administrative institutions could know about the dangers they faced. By withholding raw radiological measurements and mapping data, the state prevented a realistic risk assessment, keeping its own citizens in a state of enforced ignorance, while the invisible plume drifted across the continent. With the disaster exposed to the world, the Soviet state had to contain the open wound of Reactor 4. The immediate solution was a massive militarized cleanup operation that would eventually mobilize an estimated 600,000 people. These were the liquidators, a vast force of soldiers, miners, power plant staff, and civilian volunteers. To clear the highly radioactive debris from the reactor roof, officials initially deployed remote-controlled heavy machinery and robotic rovers from West Germany and the Soviet Union. But the intense ionizing radiation quickly fried the delicate electronic circuitry of these machines, leaving them dead in the ruins. With technology useless, the state turned to human labor. Soldiers and workers nicknamed biorobots were sent onto the roof of the adjacent Reactor 3. Clad in makeshift lead sheets sewn onto standard uniforms, these men faced radiation fields so intense that their shifts were limited to just 90 seconds. Armed with heavy shovels, they ran into the debris, scooped up chunks of highly radioactive graphite and fuel, threw them back into the exposed core, and ran back. This grueling human chain worked in tandem with engineers constructing the original sarcophagus. By December 1986, after pouring hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of concrete and assembling massive steel panels under lethal conditions, the ruins of Reactor 4 were finally sealed in a temporary tomb. The immediate crisis was contained, but the risk had been paid for in human health and lives. 30 plant workers and firefighters died from blast injuries and acute radiation syndrome in the immediate aftermath of the explosion. In the decades since, the most clearly documented long-term health consequence has been a major increase in thyroid cancer among those who were children or teenagers in 1986, primarily from drinking milk contaminated with radioactive iodine. Over 19,000 cases have been recorded across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, though early detection and effective treatment kept the mortality rate low. Estimating broader long-term cancer deaths remains a subject of intense scientific debate. While the Chernobyl Forum projected around 4,000 potential excess cancer deaths among the most highly exposed populations, other statistical models suggest far higher numbers. These figures remain theoretical calculations rather than settled, verifiable data. The social and economic toll was immediate. Over 115,000 people were permanently displaced from the exclusion zone, abandoning their homes, farms, and communities to escape lasting cesium-137 contamination. The massive financial burden of containment, coupled with the political fallout of the initial cover-up, severely strained the Soviet state. Chernobyl was not simply a reactor explosion. It showed what can happen when flawed technology, human decisions, incomplete information, and institutional pressure collide. If you enjoy documentaries that investigate how extraordinary real events happened, subscribe to the Atlas Network, where new full documentaries premiere every Friday, with feature documentaries and shorts throughout the week. The official assessment of what caused the disaster changed significantly in the years following the explosion. Initially, the Soviet state and early international reports, like the 1986 INSAG-1 document, placed almost exclusive blame on the operating crew, citing serious safety violations. But as more technical data emerged, this narrow explanation collapsed. By 1992, the revised INSAG-7 report reframed the catastrophe as a systemic failure rather than simple operator error. Investigators recognized that the RBMK's underlying design flaws, specifically its positive void coefficient and the hazardous characteristics of the control rods, created an unforgiving machine. Later assessments expanded to criticize the broader Soviet safety culture, pointing to inadequate operating procedures and intense institutional pressure that prioritized production over caution. Instead of blaming a single villain, modern analysis views Chernobyl as a multifactorial failure, where flawed technology and human actions collided within an environment of institutional secrecy. Today, the exclusion zone remains a quiet monument. In Pripyat, nature slowly reclaims concrete blocks and abandoned playgrounds. Over Reactor 4, the new safe confinement arch stands as a 100-year shield, protecting against the remaining hazards locked inside through constant monitoring. This ongoing vigil exposes the practical safety criteria of the modern age: the absolute necessity of transparent information, sound design, realistic procedures, and the freedom to challenge unsafe decisions. Chernobyl was not simply a reactor explosion. It showed what can happen when flawed technology, human decisions, incomplete information, and institutional pressure collide. If you enjoy documentaries that investigate how extraordinary real events happened, subscribe to the Atlas Network, where new full documentaries premiere every Friday, with feature documentaries and shorts throughout the week. Today, the steel arch shields us from the ruins of Reactor 4, but no engineering can contain the human element. In an era still powered by split atoms, our greatest safeguard remains transparency. Chernobyl was not simply a reactor explosion. It showed what can happen when flawed technology, human decisions, incomplete information, and institutional pressure collide. What if the most dangerous places on Earth are not the ones we know nothing about, but the ones where what we do know is the most disturbing part? We investigated 10 locations spread across 5 continents: toxic lakes, radioactive wastelands, forbidden islands, battlefields that never stopped killing, and ranked them by one criterion: how strong is the evidence that you should never go there? The answer at number 1 carries a warning: no other entry on this list can match. We begin where the danger hides in plain sight, in the most visited desert in America. In the 10th place, Death Valley presents a danger that is completely documented rather than mysterious. This open desert basin is defined by extreme environmental hostility, where a single miscalculation can quickly become fatal. In 1913, meteorologists recorded a surface air temperature of 56.7 degrees Celsius, 134 degrees Fahrenheit, at Furnace Creek, a world record that stands to this day. When exposed to this level of heat, the human body struggles to cool itself, leading rapidly to severe dehydration, hyperthermia, and organ failure. While popular folklore sensationalizes stories of spontaneous combustion, the real threat is far more mundane and scientific: plain heat illness. Every summer, the National Park Service issues strict seasonal advisories and road closures as extreme temperatures trigger dozens of emergency rescues. Tourists frequently underestimate the vast distances in the dry air, which evaporates sweat before it can even be noticed. It is a stark reminder of how a familiar, accessible location can become a lethal trap through simple exposure. This harsh, arid climate shows how easily nature can overwhelm human biology, setting a baseline for the chemically hostile environments that lie ahead. Number 9. Lake Natron in northern Tanzania presents a hazard born of extreme chemistry. This isolated saline alkaline lake features water that regularly reaches a pH of 10.5, a caustic level equivalent to household ammonia. Saturated with natron salts and active sodium carbonate, the shallow water causes rapid skin desiccation and can blind unprotected eyes on contact. Popular legends claim the lake instantly petrifies any living creature that touches it, turning animals to stone. The scientific reality is more gradual. The high mineral concentration slowly encrusts and calcifies carcasses, leaving behind bone-dry, preserved specimens coated in a white, chalky residue. Despite this extreme hostility, the lake remains a protected habitat within the Natron Lake game-controlled area. It serves as a vital, fragile nesting ground for millions of lesser flamingos, who rely on the caustic, isolated shallows as a natural barrier to keep predators away. Trespassing into this remote, corrosive basin poses severe physiological dangers to travelers while threatening a highly sensitive breeding sanctuary. Here, extreme chemistry preserves the physical evidence of death, leading directly to a place where sudden abandonment preserves the physical remnants of human crisis instead. In the 8th place, North Brother Island shifts the focus from natural hazards to human-made isolation. Located in New York City's East River, this 16-acre landmass was purchased in 1885 to establish Riverside Hospital, a quarantine facility designed to contain highly infectious diseases like smallpox and yellow fever. Its most infamous resident was Mary Mallon, known as Typhoid Mary, who was forcibly confined to a brick bungalow on the island for nearly 3 decades until her death in 1938. The advent of modern antibiotics rendered such isolation facilities obsolete, leading to the permanent closure of the hospital complex in 1963. Today, nature has reclaimed the site, leaving its 25 remaining structures in a state of extreme dilapidation. Unstable masonry, collapsed roofs, and hazardous debris make the ruins physically dangerous. Now managed as a restricted bird sanctuary to protect nesting water birds, the island is strictly off limits to the public. The city enforces this year-round ban with patrols, and unauthorized landings regularly result in arrest. The crumbling hospital serves as a silent monument to early public health crises, sealed off by decay and memory. Number 7. Bohemian Grove in Northern California shifts the barrier from physical decay to legal restriction. Owned outright by the private Bohemian Club, this 2,700-acre redwood campground is protected by strict California trespassing laws and heavily monitored security. The club pays roughly $250,000 in annual property taxes to maintain the exclusive retreat. Every July, high-profile figures from politics, business, and entertainment gather here for a 2-week summer retreat. The event begins with the Cremation of Care, a theatrical performance where members symbolically burn an effigy called Dull Care before a giant stone owl. While this closed-door ceremony has fueled decades of wild conspiracy theories about occult rituals and global shadow governments, academic studies confirm a much more mundane reality. The Grove functions as an elite social club, offering informal networking and relaxation. No credible evidence supports claims of covert policymaking. Local sheriff deputies guard the perimeter, and unauthorized entry can lead directly to arrest and prosecution. It is a place kept off limits entirely by human choice, but other dangerous locations are guarded by a climate that fiercely resists human survival. In the 6th place, the Danakil Depression in northern Ethiopia marks a transition into extreme physical hostility, where geological forces render the terrain itself actively toxic. This low-lying desert basin sits over a tectonic triple junction where 3 tectonic plates are tearing apart, forcing magma close to the surface and fueling volatile volcanism. Ground temperatures here regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius, while active volcanic fissures vent invisible, heavy clouds of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide directly into the atmosphere. These toxic gases pool in low oxygen depressions, creating localized suffocation zones that can overcome unprotected travelers without warning. Nearby, active lava lakes bubble continuously, casting a dull red glow against the sprawling salt flats. Alongside the dangerous air, the Earth is physically unstable. Hydrothermal fields boil highly corrosive acid, creating thin, deceptive salt crusts that can easily collapse under a visitor's weight, inflicting severe thermal and chemical burns. Yet, despite these hazards, Afar miners have worked in these harsh conditions for generations to manually carve out salt blocks, enduring the corrosive wind as part of their daily labor. Because of these severe geological threats, the Ethiopian government requires specialized security clearances and official permits for any foreign crews accessing the region. It is a territory where survival requires constant vigilance, a place where the physical planet itself actively resists human intrusion. Number 5. Zone Rouge in northeastern France is a landscape where the violence of a conflict remains active long after the guns fall silent. During World War I, intense artillery battles utterly destroyed this region, leaving behind a scarred terrain saturated with chemical weapons, lead, and millions of unexploded shells. Immediately after the 1918 armistice, the French government designated this land too physically and environmentally damaged for human use. Today, over a century later, roughly 100 square kilometers remain legally off-limits. This is not an empty forest. It is a buried minefield, where a single footstep can still trigger an explosion. The danger is so persistent that the specialized Service de Déminage must deploy remote-controlled robots to clear ordnance before any work is permitted. Alongside the blast risk, the ground itself is highly toxic. Localized arsenic levels in the soil reach up to 17 grams per kilogram, thousands of times higher than normal limits, creating a chronic soil pollution syndrome. French authorities strictly enforce the no-entry zones under laws dating back to 1919, imposing fines of up to 75,000 euros for trespassing. Once the ground itself has been weaponized, the scars of war refuse to heal, leaving a lethal legacy that outlives the conflict itself. Number 4. Ilha da Queimada Grande, widely known as Snake Island, presents an immediate biological hazard off the coast of Brazil. This 43-hectare island is the exclusive home of the golden lancehead, a critically endangered pit viper species. Thousands of years of isolation from mainland predators allowed these snakes to multiply rapidly, adapting to hunt migrating birds. This evolutionary path resulted in a highly specialized, fast-acting venom designed to melt flesh and neutralize prey almost instantly. Field surveys suggest a density of up to 4,000 vipers per square mile, transforming the thick canopy into a biological minefield. While sensational internet folklore claims hundreds of visitors have died here, official records show no corroborated civilian casualties, primarily because landing is strictly outlawed. The Brazilian Institute of the Environment and Renewable Natural Resources heavily restricts access, permitting only authorized scientific researchers with medical escorts to step ashore. For anyone else, the risk is absolute. A single bite on this remote rock, located 33 kilometers off the coast, offers no casual rescue options and makes medical intervention virtually impossible before the venom takes hold. It is a place where the threat is highly concentrated, visible, and alive, showing how nature can defend a territory without human intervention. Coming to the top 3, the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Ukraine presents a hazard that is completely invisible, highly persistent, and backed by decades of rigorous scientific monitoring. Following the catastrophic reactor meltdown in 1986, Soviet authorities established a strict 30-kilometer exclusion zone that remains legally restricted to this day. Unlike immediate physical threats, the danger here lingers silently in the soil, water, and decaying infrastructure. Radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 continue to decay on a human timescale, creating a complex grid of concentrated hotspots. Environmental studies confirm that groundwater transport actively carries these radionuclides, while seasonal forest fires, such as those monitored between 2022 and 2023, temporarily loft contaminated ash back into the atmosphere. Despite these hazards, a rising wave of extreme tourism and curated imagery has created a false sense of safety. While visitors walk along approved paths, the real threat lies just feet away in unmonitored areas where radiation levels spike dramatically. Rumors of mutated wildlife are largely sensationalized. Scientists instead document a resilient ecosystem reclaiming the abandoned structures, though the underlying chemical instability remains. Ukrainian authorities continue to prosecute illegal trespassers who bypass security checkpoints, proving that once a disaster leaves an invisible map of danger, the territory remains restricted because the boundaries of safety are still being contested. In second place, Ramri Island, off the coast of Myanmar, represents a notorious intersection of wartime chaos and disputed history. The location is globally famous for what was once recognized as the worst crocodile disaster on record. According to a 1962 memoir by Canadian naturalist Bruce Stanley Wright, who served with an amphibious Allied unit during the 1945 battle, hundreds of retreating Japanese soldiers were systematically dragged down and devoured by saltwater crocodiles in the pitch-black mangrove swamps, leaving only 20 survivors out of nearly 1,000 men. Yet, historical archives tell a completely different story. Comprehensive reviews of British war diaries, military logs, and Japanese survivor testimonies reveal zero official documentation of any massive reptilian onslaught. A rigorous scientific reassessment published in 2001 by herpetologist Stephen Platt estimated that while crocodiles inhabited the tidal channels, they likely claimed only 10 to 15 lives. The vast majority of the Japanese soldiers succumbed to combat wounds, dehydration, malaria, and drowning in the thick tidal mud. Today, the biological threat of the saltwater crocodiles has largely vanished, as the species has been functionally extirpated from the island due to decades of hunting and habitat loss. But Ramri remains exceptionally dangerous for visitors for entirely modern reasons. Situated in Myanmar's volatile Rakhine state, the island is currently engulfed in violent, ongoing conflict between armed factions, including the military junta and the Arakan army. Strict security checkpoints, restricted travel permits, and active military operations make the territory virtually impossible to access for foreign researchers, journalists, or travelers. Even without the ancient threat of the swamps, the island's borders are actively defended by modern warfare, proving that sometimes the true danger of a territory shifts, but the boundary remains closed. And finally, in first place, North Sentinel Island in the Indian Ocean represents a territory where human exclusion is enforced by both international ethics and defensive resistance. For thousands of years, the Sentinelese people have lived in voluntary isolation on this forested landmass. The Indian government strictly maintains a 5 nautical mile maritime exclusion zone around the island, a buffer zone designed to protect both outsiders and the tribe itself. The primary danger here is biosecurity. Because the Sentinelese have lived in complete isolation, they lack immunity to common global pathogens like influenza or measles. A simple cold introduced by a visitor could easily destroy the entire population. This extreme biological vulnerability underpins the legal framework protecting their right to be left alone, a principle supported by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Despite clear warnings, fatal intrusions have occurred. In 2006, 2 fishermen who drifted onto the island's reefs were killed by defensive arrow fire. In 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow illegally paid local fishermen to transport him to the island. Chow was killed shortly after landing on the beach. When the Indian Coast Guard attempted a recovery operation via helicopter, they were forced to retreat under a volley of arrows, highlighting the absolute refusal of outside contact. Sensational rumors often claim the Sentinelese practice cannibalism or possess secret technology, but historical and anthropological records completely refute these stories. The tribe acts out of defensive survival, protecting their borders from external threats. Ultimately, North Sentinel Island remains completely closed to the world, because the known scientific and ethical realities make any human entry indefensible. If you want to discover more investigative documentaries about the world's most mysterious realities, subscribe to the channel. Across all 10 locations, one truth emerges. The most dangerous borders are the ones we created ourselves through war, industry, and neglect. These sites remain terrifying not because of myth, but because the verified reality of what happened there is too devastating to ignore. Human curiosity drew us to the edge, but these borders must remain closed. Subscribe to join us on our next investigation. 5 cases, years of evidence, 0 answers. We are counting down 5 unsolved American mysteries where every lead, every theory, every search has fallen short. An abandoned vehicle in a frozen mountain wilderness with no explanation for how it got there. A desperate phone call that suddenly cuts to silence. 5 children who vanished after a Christmas Eve fire and may never have been in the house at all. And the final mystery is not simply about what happened. It is about whether a family spent the rest of their lives searching for children who may have still been alive. This video discusses real disappearances, deaths, and unresolved investigations. Some details may be disturbing. The information presented is based on publicly available reports, documented investigations, historical records, and witness statements. Competing theories are included for discussion, but speculation must not be presented as established fact. In the 5th place, the Plumas National Forest in California became the stage for one of the most baffling cases in American history. On February 24, 1978, 5 young men from Yuba City, Gary Mathias, Ted Weiher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jack Hewitt, attended a college basketball game in Chico. They never made it back home alive. 4 days later, Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego was found abandoned on a remote, snow-packed mountain road at an elevation of 4,400 feet, far off their expected route. The vehicle itself was fully operational and showed no mechanical issues. It had a quarter tank of fuel, the doors were unlocked, and the tires were intact. There was no damage, yet the men walked away into a severe mountain winter storm. Only 4 sets of distinct footprints were found leading away from the abandoned car. In June, searchers located a remote Forest Service trailer 20 miles away. Inside, Ted Weiher's emaciated body lay, wrapped carefully in 8 thick blankets. The autopsy confirmed he survived between 8 and 13 weeks, ultimately dying of starvation and hypothermia. Curiously, a massive cache of non-perishable food, water, a propane heater, and fuel remained completely untouched inside the trailer. The skeletal remains of Madruga, Sterling, and Hewitt were eventually recovered in the surrounding woods, showing signs of animal scavenging. Gary Mathias's shoes were found abandoned inside the trailer, but his body was never located. All 5 men lived with mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions, including Mathias's schizophrenia, which required regular medication. Investigators remained paralyzed by the central contradiction. Why would men freeze and starve to death in a shelter stocked with the very food and heat that could have saved their lives? In the 4th place, a midnight phone call in rural Minnesota ended with a sudden exclamation that still echoes for investigators. On May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving home to Marshall after celebrating the end of the college semester when he steered his Chevrolet Lumina into a sharp roadside ditch. Unharmed, he called his parents at 2:05 in the morning, explaining that his car was stuck and asking them to pick him up. He told them he was near the town of Lynn and could see the lights of the town nearby. He decided to walk toward those lights while keeping his father on the phone. For 47 minutes, they spoke as Brandon walked along gravel roads, describing the gravel under his feet in the night air. Then, at 3:10 in the morning, Brandon suddenly yelled, "Oh, shit!" and the line went dead. His parents rushed to find him, but they were searching in the wrong place. Although Brandon was convinced he was near Lind, subpoenaed cell phone tower records later revealed a massive geographical discrepancy. His phone was actually pinging off a tower 25 miles away, near the small town of Taunton. When police located his abandoned Chevrolet Lumina the next morning, it was indeed sitting in a ditch on Lincoln Lyon Road near Taunton, with the keys missing and the doors wide open. Despite massive ground searches, aerial sweeps, and canine teams combing a 10-square-mile grid, searchers found no other trace of Brandon. Tracking dogs eventually followed his scent to the banks of the nearby Yellow Medicine River, leading authorities to suspect he might have fallen into the fast-flowing water and drowned in the darkness. Yet, extensive searches of the riverbed and downstream banks yielded no clothing, footprints, or remains. Brandon Swanson simply vanished into the Minnesota prairie, leaving behind only a silent cell phone signal and a final, unexplained exclamation. In the third place, a remote forest road in the Sans Bois Mountains of Oklahoma became the final destination for a family seeking a fresh start. On October 8, 2009, Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison drove into the rugged hills to look at a 40-acre plot of land. They never returned. 8 days later, hunters discovered their 1999 Chevrolet pickup truck abandoned on a gravel path, locked and undisturbed. Inside the vehicle, investigators found a series of baffling contradictions. The family's small dog was locked in the cabin, severely dehydrated, but still alive after more than a week without sustenance. Under the front seat sat $32,000 in cash, along with the family's wallets, identification cards, warm coats, and GPS unit. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of blood, and no indications of forced entry. It was as if the Jamisons had simply stepped out for a moment and vanished. The investigation took a stranger turn when police reviewed security footage from the family's home recorded the morning of their departure. The video showed Bobby and Sherilyn moving in a silent, trance-like state, loading the truck over several hours without speaking to one another. Local search efforts across the rugged terrain yielded no clues until November 2013, when hunters stumbled upon skeletal remains just 3 miles from the abandoned truck. Forensic testing confirmed the bones belonged to the Jamison family. The bodies were found lying face down, side by side in a neat row. Because of the extreme decomposition of the skeletal remains, the medical examiner could not determine a definitive cause of death, leaving open theories ranging from murder-suicide and drug involvement to hypothermia. The physical evidence provides no clear path. Investigators remain left with the central puzzle of why a family would abandon their vehicle, their life savings, and their beloved pet, only to walk together into the quiet mountain woods to die. In second place, a rain-slicked runway in Seattle and the roar of a Boeing 727 engine began one of the most audacious crimes in aviation history. On November 24, 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded a short flight from Portland to Seattle. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a flight attendant a note claiming he possessed a bomb in his briefcase. His demands were clear: $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 military-grade parachutes. Once the plane landed in Seattle, Cooper exchanged the 36 passengers for the cash and survival gear, ordering the crew to fly toward Reno, Nevada at a low altitude with the landing gear down. Somewhere over the dense forests of southwestern Washington, during a blinding rainstorm, Cooper lowered the plane's aft stairs and leapt into the freezing darkness. He was never seen again. Despite a massive, decades-long FBI investigation codenamed Norjack, authorities found no body, no parachute canopy, and no clothing. The only physical items linking the hijacker to the crime were a black clip-on tie left on seat 18E and a small portion of the cash discovered years later. In 1980, an 8-year-old boy digging in the sand at Tina Bar, a beach along the Columbia River, uncovered 3 rotting packets of the $20 bills totaling $5,800. The serial numbers matched the ransom money, but the location of the bills only deepened the mystery. If Cooper perished during his jump, the wilderness should have eventually yielded his remains or the rest of the fortune. If he survived, he managed to slip away into the night without leaving a single trace. After 45 years of tracking thousands of leads, the FBI officially suspended the active investigation in 2016. And finally, in first place on Christmas Eve 1945, a devastating house fire in Fayetteville, West Virginia, left behind an agonizing mystery that would haunt a family for the rest of their lives. George and Jenny Sauter, along with 4 of their children, escaped the roaring blaze. 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were trapped upstairs. But when the fire subsided, the expected tragedy turned into a bizarre puzzle. A thorough search of the ash yielded 0 skeletal remains, dental fragments, or biological trace of the 5 missing children. State fire marshals claimed the heat of the fire cremated the bodies, yet bone experts refuted this, noting that a typical house fire cannot burn hot enough or long enough to completely obliterate human skeletons. In the days surrounding the fire, a series of deliberate acts came to light. The family's telephone line was cut. A ladder usually kept against the house was found moved to a nearby embankment. George Sauter tried to use his 2 work trucks to drive closer to the upstairs windows, but both vehicles mysteriously failed to start, despite functioning perfectly the day before. Suspicion turned toward kidnapping, fueled by an incident months earlier when a stranger warned George that his house would go up in smoke due to his outspoken criticism of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. For decades, the Sauters refused to believe their children perished, erecting a massive billboard along Route 19 featuring the children's faces and offering a large reward. The mystery deepened in 1968 when Jenny received a letter postmarked from Kentucky containing a photograph of a young man bearing a striking resemblance to Louis Sauter with a cryptic note on the back. No law enforcement agency could trace the sender. With no physical remains ever recovered from the ashes, the fate of the 5 Sauter children remains entirely unresolved. Subscribe to our channel for more investigations into history's most perplexing cases. Across all 5 of these cases, a haunting pattern emerges. Investigators are left with a wealth of physical evidence: a parked car with a quarter tank of gas, a silent cell phone signal, a neat stack of cash left under a truck seat, or the ashes of a destroyed home. Yet none of these tangible clues lead to a definitive resolution. The true tragedy of an unsolved mystery lies not just in the suddenness of the loss, but in the permanent silence that follows. For the families of the Yuba County 5, Brandon Swanson, the Jamesons, and the Sauter children, the passage of years does not bring healing. Instead, it solidifies the agonizing weight of the unknown. These relatives are forced to live in a state of suspended grief where every potential lead eventually ends in frustration, and every plausible explanation fails to account for the physical reality left behind. In each instance, science and technology reach their limits. Search dogs lost scents at the water's edge. Cell towers provided contradictory coordinates, and fire investigations failed to yield expected biological trace. These cases stand as a sobering reminder of how easily the physical world can swallow human lives, leaving behind nothing but questions. At its core, the human mind craves closure, a logical sequence of cause and effect that explains why people disappear. But these mysteries offer no such comfort. They exist in the frustrating space between what can be documented and what can be proven. As decades pass, the witnesses age, the physical evidence degrades, and the hope for definitive answers slowly slips away. The enduring enigma of these cases lies in that very gap. Investigators can trace the coordinates of a cell phone or catalog the untouched cans of food in a forest shelter, but they cannot map the final decisions of those who vanished. These quiet locations, the high snows of Plumas National Forest, the vast prairies of Minnesota, and the rugged hills of Oklahoma silently hold the answers, keeping their secrets locked away. Every year, thousands of individuals vanish across the United States, leaving behind families, investigators, and a trail of incomplete evidence. In most cases, time and technology eventually provide answers. A recovered vehicle, a sudden confession, or a modern forensic breakthrough eventually solves the puzzle. But some cases resist every effort, remaining completely insulated from resolution despite decades of active inquiry. These are the stories that defy logical explanation, where every plausible theory is countered by a piece of conflicting physical reality. When examining these mysteries, investigators often confront a specific kind of frustration. Instead of a total void, they find an abundance of clues that lead in entirely opposite directions. A pristine car abandoned in the snow with plenty of fuel, a final frantic phone call ending in a single exclamation, or a family truck containing a large amount of cash. These details do not clarify what occurred. Instead, they intensify the silence. The files remain open because the facts themselves refuse to fit together, despite years of active investigation. The true weight of these unresolved events falls upon the families left behind, forced to exist in a permanent state of suspended grief. For these relatives, the passage of decades offers no comfort, only the agonizing reality of living without certainty. The physical world simply swallowed their loved ones, leaving only empty coordinates, silent phone records, and questions that grow heavier with each passing year. As search teams trace these final movements, they find that science and traditional search methods eventually reach their absolute limit. 5 of America's most haunting unsolved cases represent the precise boundary where documented facts end and the unexplained begins. Through documented timelines, recovered physical evidence, and the enduring gaps in each record, these cases continue to challenge everything known about how people disappear, leaving behind puzzles that modern science cannot answer. Across all 5 cases, the pattern reveals that the deepest mystery is not a lack of evidence, but the contradictions within it. These investigations prove that some truths remain entirely out of reach, leaving families to carry the weight of perpetual uncertainty. They remind us that behind every unsolved file is a devastating human cost. Subscribe for more deep dive investigations. The following documentary is based on publicly available reports, official investigations, and expert analysis. Some aspects of this case remain actively disputed, and key questions are still unsolved. A modern Boeing 777 carrying 239 people simply vanished. No distress call, no confirmed crash site. Despite one of the largest search operations in aviation history, investigators still cannot answer one simple question. What really happened to Flight MH37? The twin-engine Boeing 777-200ER, registration 9 MMRO, was a workhorse of the sky. Delivered in 2002, the aircraft had logged over 53,000 flight hours before its final departure. It was a reliable model with an exceptional safety record, having passed its last major maintenance check just 12 days earlier. At the controls was 53-year-old Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a highly respected veteran with 18,000 hours of flying experience. Beside him sat 27-year-old First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, completing his final training flight to fully qualify on the 777. Behind them in the cabin were 227 passengers representing 14 nations, including families, 20 tech employees, and a group of Chinese calligraphy artists returning home from an exhibition. Just after midnight on March 8, 2014, the flight departed Kuala Lumpur under clear, calm skies. The climb was routine. Air traffic controllers cleared the plane to 35,000 feet as it headed northeast over the South China Sea toward Beijing. On board, nothing suggested this flight would be anything other than a normal, quiet overnight crossing. At 0107, the plane's automated tracking system, ACARS, sent a routine status report confirming it was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. 12 minutes later, the flight approached the edge of Malaysian airspace. The handoff to Vietnam was expected next. At 0119, Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control radioed a standard sign-off. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah replied, "Good night, Malaysian 370. There was no hint of trouble, no urgency, and no distress call. It was the last voice transmission ever heard from the cockpit. 2 minutes later, at 0121, the aircraft crossed waypoint Igari. Instantly, the signal vanished from civilian radar displays. Civilian tracking relies on secondary radar, which requires a transponder on the airplane to actively broadcast its identity, altitude, and speed. When the transponder went dark near Igari, the flight's data block simply vanished from air traffic control screens. Vietnamese controllers expected a radio check-in that never came. Operational confusion quickly took hold. For 17 minutes, controllers struggled to establish contact before Ho Chi Minh City officials formally queried Kuala Lumpur. But the aircraft was still moving. Military primary radar, which does not rely on transponders, but instead bounces raw radio waves off the metal hull of an aircraft, continued to track a silent target. This primary radar recorded a sharp westward turn, taking the plane back across the Malay Peninsula, around Penang, and out toward the Andaman Sea. Because military data is incomplete, reports of extreme climbs and descents during this turn are treated with caution. Air defense operators initially classified the radar blip as friendly. They did not alert civilian controllers, causing a costly delay. It was hours before authorities realized the aircraft had gone off route, and by then the trail was cold. The final primary radar contact faded between 0215 and 0221, leaving the Boeing 777 flying into a vast, silent void. Because Flight 370 vanished from civilian radar over the Gulf of Thailand, rescue teams focused their initial efforts on those warm, shallow waters. Navies and spotter planes from Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, and China rushed to the South China Sea, expecting to find wreckage along the aircraft's planned path to Beijing. Within days, a massive multinational response deployed over 40 aircraft and 24 surface ships. But scanning the open ocean from the air is a deceptive task. Spotting debris from thousands of feet up means fighting constant cloud cover, sun glare, and a sea littered with discarded maritime trash. When early calculations redirected the search thousands of miles away, the operation transformed from a surface recovery into the most complex deep-sea hunt in history. Now led by Australia alongside Malaysia, the search shifted to the remote southern Indian Ocean. Here, the practical difficulties were immense. Crews deployed high-tech sonar and autonomous underwater vehicles like the Bluefin 21 to map a rugged mountainous seafloor. They worked in freezing depths reaching 6,000 meters, where crushing water pressure and violent storms frequently forced operations to a halt. By the time the official search was suspended in January 2017, teams had surveyed 120,000 square kilometers of seabed. The effort cost $155 million, making it the most expensive aviation search in history. Yet, it yielded absolutely nothing. Even the most advanced technology cannot find an aircraft when the underlying probability model is wrong. To locate the missing Boeing 777, investigators had to look beyond traditional flight tracking, searching for a completely different kind of clue. The breakthrough in tracking did not come from radar, but from a geostationary satellite floating 36,000 kilometers above the equator. The aircraft's satellite data unit, which had powered back up shortly after the transponder went dark, began exchanging automated signals with the Inmarsat 3F1 satellite. These were not voice messages or telemetry reports, but simple electronic handshakes, automated requests confirming the plane was still connected to the network. 7 of these handshakes were logged between 0225 and a final partial transmission at 0819. To turn these silent pings into geographic coordinates, engineers from Inmarsat collaborated with the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, Boeing, and the NTSB. They relied on two obscure pieces of metadata, burst timing offset and burst frequency offset. Burst timing offset, or BTO, measures the exact round-trip travel time of the signal. This allowed analysts to calculate the precise distance between the satellite and the aircraft. Plotting this distance on the globe produced a series of curved rings or arcs rather than a single point. Burst frequency offset, or BFO, measures the Doppler shift, the subtle change in the radio frequency caused by the relative movement between the satellite and the aircraft. This measurement provided a way to estimate the plane's speed and heading. This analysis originally projected two vast flight paths, a northern corridor stretching across Central Asia, and a southern corridor heading toward Antarctica. Because a northern route would have crossed highly monitored overland airspace without triggering military radar, and because the BFO data strongly matched a southern track, investigators disfavored the northern option. On March 24, 2014, authorities announced the southern Indian Ocean as the leading search zone. The final partial handshake at 0819 defined a curved boundary known as the seventh arc. By calculating fuel limits, satellite drift, and heading assumptions, analysts established a probable corridor. Yet, this remained a statistical model, not a confirmed impact site. It was a probabilistic map that would soon guide oceanographers attempting to backtrack the physical evidence. On July 29, 2015, a beach cleanup crew on the French island of Réunion found a barnacle-encrusted 6-foot-long piece of metal washed ashore. It was a right-hand wing flaperon. Forensic teams matched its specific part markings, paint layers, and rivet characteristics to 9M MRO, providing the first physical proof that Flight 370 had entered the ocean. Over the next few years, more fragments surfaced along the coastlines of Mozambique, Tanzania, South Africa, Mauritius, Rodriguez, and Madagascar. Investigators categorized these items carefully, confirming some as definitely or almost certainly from the missing Boeing 777, while others remained unconfirmed. To understand where these pieces came from, oceanographers at Australia's CSIRO used computer models to simulate Indian Ocean currents and wind patterns, backtracking the floating debris. This was a probability analysis rather than a precise GPS trail, but it supported the southern search corridor. The physical evidence establishes that the aircraft broke apart in the ocean, and that floating components survived to drift thousands of miles. However, it cannot pinpoint the exact crash coordinates, reveal the final breakup sequence, or prove whether a pilot was actively controlling the aircraft during its final descent into the water. To resolve the mystery of Flight 370, investigators must operate within strict analytical boundaries, separating verified evidence from theory. Under the category of confirmed facts, the physical and electronic record is clear. The aircraft deviated from its filed route, and conventional communications and identification signals were lost. Satellite data indicate that the plane remained airborne for several hours after conventional contact ended. While debris linked to the aircraft eventually washed up in the western Indian Ocean, the primary wreckage and flight recorders remain unavailable. To this day, no definitive cause has been established. Official findings provide the institutional framework. The July 2018 Malaysian Safety Investigation Report left the cause of the disappearance undetermined. Investigators assessed that manual control inputs were the most likely explanation for the aircraft's deviation. However, this finding does not identify who made those inputs or why. No motive or intentional act was conclusively established, and no significant pre-existing maintenance defects were identified that could explain the disappearance. Expert opinions attempt to fill the remaining gaps, dividing the possibilities into distinct, evidence-based theories. The first is the pilot intentional act theory. Supporting considerations include the sharp route changes, the sequential loss of communications, the apparent coherence of the flight path, and a 2016 home simulator wrote on Captain Zahari's computer that resembled part of the southern trajectory. The weaknesses are substantial. There is no confirmed motive, no cockpit recordings of intent, and no wreckage evidence showing who is in control. The simulator route remains a consideration, not proof of intent. The second is hypoxia or crew incapacitation. A sudden loss of cabin pressure could disable the crew, allowing the aircraft to fly on autopilot until fuel starvation. The weakness is the lack of any confirmed depressurization warning, and the difficulty of explaining how an incapacitated crew could perform the initial, complex route changes. Whether anyone stayed conscious during the final hours remains unknown. The third is mechanical or electrical failure. A sudden emergency could disable electronics and make the plane difficult to fly. However, the aircraft was fully airworthy at departure, and there is no wreckage to examine for structural failure. Whether an unusual failure could disable multiple communication systems without leaving a recoverable warning remains unknown. The fourth is an onboard fire. A fire, perhaps involving the lithium-ion batteries and mangosteens in the cargo, could explain a sudden diversion. Yet, physical testing showed no hazardous interaction between these items, no fire emergency was transmitted, and satellite power remained active for hours. It remains unknown if a fire could disable communications while leaving primary electrical power intact. The fifth is hijacking or unlawful interference. The route changes are broadly compatible with outside intervention. The weakness is the absolute absence of a credible claim, demand, or accomplice. The sixth is a combined event scenario, where a sudden technical emergency followed by incapacitation could mimic a deliberate flight path in the incomplete satellite records. Outside these theories lies speculation. Claims of secret cargo, hidden passengers, unverified military action, or precise final sequences lack any corroborating data. Ultimately, the reconstructed route and missing signals do not prove motive, identity, or criminal intent. No evidence permits assigning blame to Zahari, Farik, or any passenger, and no single theory explains every known fact. If you enjoy factual documentaries exploring history's greatest mysteries, true crime, dangerous places, science, and unexplained events, subscribe to the Atlas Network. In January 2018, private marine robotics firm Ocean Infinity launched a new sweep of the southern Indian Ocean. Operating on a confirmed no-fine, no-fee basis, the company deployed a fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles. These robotic units swam independently near the seabed, mapping rugged terrain with high-resolution sonar. Over several months, they scanned approximately 81,500 square kilometers of ocean floor without success, proving that even the best equipment cannot find an aircraft if the search zone is wrong. Beyond this completed operation, later developments are classified as reported or proposed. This includes reports of renewed search activity in 2025 and 2026, which require official verification by Malaysian authorities. Meanwhile, researchers continue to study refined drift models to narrow where floating material originated. Independent scientists have also re-examined regional acoustic data, suggesting that some signals once thought to be locator beacons were actually marine life. Various alternative wreck site hypotheses have been proposed, but they remain uncorroborated, while new search proposals could improve the odds of discovery. Only the physical recovery of the fuselage, debris field, and flight recorders can provide a definitive resolution. For the families of those on board, neither official declarations nor compensation can replace verified knowledge of the final hours. Their lives remain suspended in a quiet defined by absence. This tragedy forced global aviation to confront a glaring vulnerability. A modern passenger jet must not be allowed to vanish simply because its transponder stops transmitting. In response, international regulators adopted tracking reforms under the Global Aeronautical Distress and Safety System. Today, commercial flights over open water must report their positions at least every 15 minutes. Underwater signaling devices now carry 90-day batteries with improved physical placement, and manufacturers are testing satellite streaming for cockpit voice data. Yet, these reforms are lessons, not resolutions. They expose a lasting tension between sophisticated tracking systems and the sheer physical scale of the ocean. Technology can preserve evidence, but it cannot reconstruct events that were never recorded. Without the primary wreckage and flight recorders, 4 basic questions remain open. Who or what altered the flight's course? Why did communication stop? Where exactly did the aircraft come down? And what happened inside the cabin during those final hours? Until those answers are found, responsible investigation must preserve uncertainty instead of replacing it with an attractive story. We live in an era of absolute connectivity, where we assume everything is tracked. Yet, the Indian Ocean continues to guard its deepest secret. For the families, this is not a historical mystery. It is an ongoing vigil. Until the wreckage is found, MH370 remains a haunting reminder of how easily our most advanced technology can be swallowed by the dark. Newspapers across Northern California received letters from a killer while he was still killing. He signed each one with a cryptic symbol. He enclosed ciphers and dared anyone to crack them. He gave himself a name, the Zodiac, and demanded front-page attention. He taunted police with details only the murderer could know. And after more than half a century, not a single investigator can tell you his real identity. This is the unsolved mystery that still haunts America. And it didn't begin with a crime scene. It began with a message. To understand this terror, we have to look not at where the bodies were found, but at the ink on the page. Most serial killers hide in the shadows, desperate to remain invisible. This one did the opposite. He forced his way into the public consciousness, turning the local press into his personal megaphone. By mailing letters directly to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner, he bypassed detectives to speak directly to the citizens. He stamped his pages with a cross inside a circle, a cold geometric signature that offered no clues to his face, his background, or his real identity. This was a performer demanding a massive audience. He threatened to kill again if his letters were not printed on the front page. He turned the act of murder into an interactive game, holding entire cities hostage through the morning edition. This psychological pressure made his voice more terrifying than any weapon. For investigators, this created an unprecedented crisis. Traditional police work relies on physical evidence left at a crime scene. But here, the crime scene expanded across the entire region, with every single mail delivery. The letters created an omnipresent threat, making ordinary families feel as though the killer was watching them from the dark. Yet, despite his constant need to speak, to mock, and to boast, he remained a phantom. He spoke constantly, but he never revealed his name. In the late 1960s, Northern California was defined by rapid suburban expansion. Yet just beyond the newly built neighborhoods lay vast stretches of isolated darkness. On the chilly night of December 20th, 1968, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen set out on their first date. David was a high school senior who loved cars and music. Betty Lou was a bright-eyed sophomore who had spent the day writing about her excitement in her diary. They drove to Lake Herman Road, a gravel-topped, unlit corridor outside Benicia that local teenagers used as a quiet escape. Around 11 o'clock, they pulled into a secluded dirt turnout. What happened next shattered the suburban quiet. A lone vehicle pulled up beside them. Moments later, a gunman opened fire, ending both of their young lives on the gravel shoulder. Long before the letters, the cryptic symbols, or the terrifying front-page headlines, this double murder on a lonely road was treated as a localized tragedy. The nightmare had begun, but at this quiet roadside turnout, the mystery did not yet have a name. Just before midnight on July 4, 1969, the illusion of an isolated tragedy vanished. Darlene Ferrin, a 22-year-old mother and waitress, parked with 19-year-old Michael McJoe at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. A quiet evening ended when a car pulled up behind them. A man carrying a bright flashlight walked up to the passenger window and opened fire with a 9mm pistol. Darlene was killed, but Michael survived his severe wounds, becoming the first living witness to see the shooter's face. Minutes later, at 12:40 a.m., a call came into the Vallejo Police Department. Dispatcher Nancy Slover answered a payphone call placed only blocks from headquarters. A calm, monotone voice claimed responsibility for the shooting, even identifying the weapon. Then the speaker added a terrifying detail. "I also killed those kids last year." In that single sentence, the shooter linked the Blue Rock Springs attack to the murders at Lake Herman Road. This was not a random robbery or a crime of passion. It was the first unmistakable sign of a killer who wanted the police to know exactly what he had done. On July 31, 1969, 3 identical letters arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. The writer did not wait for investigators to profile him or give him a moniker. Instead, he took control of his own narrative. Across these pages, he introduced a cold geometric signature, a cross drawn inside a circle. This simple symbol, stamped on his correspondence, became his repeated signature. In these letters, he claimed the name Zodiac. By christening himself, he transformed a series of localized regional homicides into an ongoing, interactive spectacle. The letters were no longer just communications about the crimes, they were the crimes themselves, played out on the front pages. The public now had a terrifying, self-styled persona to follow, a phantom identity that filled the vacuum left by the lack of a physical suspect. The myth of the Zodiac had officially begun. Along with the letters, the killer had sent a 3-part, 408-character cryptogram. He claimed this code would reveal his true identity, turning the hunt into a race against time. But as days passed, professional code breakers hit a wall. The breakthrough came not from a government lab, but from a living room in Salinas, California. Donald Gene Harden, a high school teacher, and his wife, Betty June, took up the challenge. They spent 4 days of intensive labor over their dining table using simple pencil and paper. By applying homophonic substitution and looking for common words like killing and forest, they cracked the code. At 6:35 p.m. on August 8, 1969, they delivered their solved worksheets to the San Francisco Chronicle. The public expected a name. Instead, they got a window into pure malice. The decoded message began. "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." The rambling text offered no identity, ending with the boast, "I will not give you my name." For Vallejo Detective Sergeant John Lynch, the solution was a profound disappointment. It offered only the killer's bragging. The first major breakthrough had succeeded only in giving the phantom a voice. He had not unmasked himself. He had simply claimed his stage. On a warm Saturday afternoon, September 27, 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard drove to a quiet peninsula on the shores of Lake Berryessa. They wanted a peaceful picnic, a brief escape from classes. But the tranquility ended when a figure stepped out from the trees. He wore a heavy black hood, styled like an executioner's mask, with the cross-circle symbol stitched in white over his chest. In his hand, he held a long knife and pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline. By abandoning his firearm for a blade, the killer changed his method from distant to intimate, bringing a new level of unpredictability to the terror. He bound their hands, then attacked them both. Brian Hartnell survived multiple stab wounds, but Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later from her injuries. Before fleeing into the Napa twilight, the killer walked to Hartnell's white car door. Using a black felt-tip marker, he drew his signature cross circle. Underneath, he listed his history, the dates of the December and July attacks, followed by the day's date, the time, and a final chilling phrase, by knife. He had stepped out of the dark to compile a physical index of his crimes, claiming ownership of his path in broad daylight. On the cool night of October 11, 1969, the killer abandoned rural roads and entered the heart of San Francisco. At 9:40 p.m., 29-year-old taxi driver Paul Stein picked up a passenger who directed him to the upscale neighborhood of Presidio Heights. At the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger fired a single shot into Stein's head, took his wallet and keys, and tore away a piece of his blood-stained shirt before vanishing into the darkness. 3 teenage witnesses watched the man escape from a window across the street. They immediately called the police, describing a white male suspect. But in the chaotic transmission to Central Dispatch, a devastating error occurred. The radio broadcast warned patrol units to search for a black male. This mistake had immediate, catastrophic consequences. Patrol officers Donald Fook and Eric Zelms, driving blocks away, actually stopped a white man matching the teenager's description. Because of the incorrect radio alert, they let him walk. The killer later mailed a piece of Stein's bloody shirt to the San Francisco Chronicle, explicitly mocking the police for their goof. Paul Stein would be the final confirmed victim, but this urban strike showed the killer could adapt his methods to any environment, while a single communication failure allowed him to escape forever. The hunt for the killer was no longer a standard homicide investigation. It was a sprawling bureaucratic puzzle. Because the crimes occurred across county lines, the case was fractured among the Vallejo Police Department, the Napa County Sheriff's Office, and the San Francisco Police Department. Files were scattered, evidence was shared slowly, and no single agency held total control. Into this chaotic vacuum stepped San Francisco Homicide Inspector Dave Toschi, a detective whose upside-down shoulder holster and intense style quickly made him the public face of the manhunt. But as detectives chased dead ends, a different kind of investigation took shape inside the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle. A young political cartoonist named Robert Graysmith became consumed by the case, collecting every letter, scrap of evidence, and police lead. The press had transitioned from reporting the news to actively participating in it, printing the killer's demands and feeding a growing public fascination. With every published letter, the real-world killer began to fade, replaced by a self-perpetuating myth that outgrew the active police files. Of the thousands of tips that flooded police departments, one name repeatedly cut through the noise: Arthur Lee Allen. A former elementary school teacher and convicted child molester, Allen first drew police attention in 1971. The circumstantial overlap was striking. He wore a Seawolf wristwatch, the very brand whose cross-circle logo matched the Zodiac signature. He owned a windbreaker similar to the one seen at Lake Berryessa, drove a car matching suspect descriptions, and lived near the site of the first attacks. In 1979, he failed a polygraph test when questioned about the letters. To many investigators, and later to the public, the puzzle pieces seemed to fit perfectly. But a criminal case is built on proof, not coincidence, and the case against Allen fractured under close examination. Surviving victim Michael Mageau pointed to Allen's photo in a lineup, but other witness statements created sharp contradictions. Kathleen Johns, who escaped a late-night abduction, described her attacker as a black male, whereas Allen was white. The physical evidence repeatedly failed to connect. Experts analyzed Allen's handwriting against the killer's letters and found no match. His fingerprints and palm prints did not match the latent prints lifted from the taxicab or the envelopes. Decades later, when scientists extracted touch DNA from the stamps, Allen's genetic profile was entirely excluded. Without a direct physical link, prosecutors could not establish a provable chain of evidence. Despite executing multiple search warrants on Allen's home, police never found a matching weapon or direct forensic tie. Other names frequently surfaced in the media, men like Richard Gaikowski, Lawrence Kane, and Don Chaney, but these served more as fuel for public obsession than as viable leads. No one was ever charged. Arthur Leake Allen died in 1992, taking whatever secrets he held to his grave. The suspect who dominated the public imagination remained, in the eyes of the law, an innocent man. In December 2020, 51 years after it was mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Zodiac's most notorious puzzle finally broke. An international team of amateur codebreakers, David Aronchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl van Eyck, cracked the 340-character cipher known as Z340. They did not use secret government mainframes. They applied modern crowdsourced pattern analysis and a custom decryption program called AZ Decrypt, processing hundreds of thousands of grid permutations. The FBI officially validated the solution, but the breakthrough offered frustration rather than answers. The decoded text revealed no name. Instead, it only rebroadcast the killer's chilling, boastful voice, declaring that he was not afraid of the gas chamber because it would send him to paradise. While the cipher fell to computational mathematics, detectives turned to molecular biology. Vallejo investigators sent original mailings to forensic labs for advanced touch DNA testing, searching for microscopic skin cells and saliva traces left on stamps and envelope flaps. These techniques fundamentally changed what investigators could extract from half-century-old evidence, sparking a dramatic cycle of public breakthroughs and disputed claims. In 2021, an independent group called the Case Breakers pointed to a deceased Air Force veteran named Gary Post, claiming they had linked him to a partial DNA profile. But federal authorities quickly intervened, emphasizing that the case remained open. The DNA samples were highly degraded, and the claim was unverified. The investigative field is now split between verified scientific milestones, highly disputed theories, and outright speculation. Modern developments have successfully dismantled the killer's codes and isolated fragments of genetic material. Yet the physical identity of the Zodiac remains as elusive as it was in 1969. Decades later, the empty chairs at the victims' tables remain. The Zodiac transitioned from a flesh and blood killer into a permanent cultural ghost, escaping justice, but never our collective obsession. He wanted to be immortalized, but we must remember the lives he stole. If this journey stayed with you, please like the video. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. This documentary is based on publicly available historical records, official investigations, and credible reporting. Some details remain disputed. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a late-night safety test. But the disaster was not caused by one single mistake. It was the final result of a chain of decisions, design flaws, misunderstood reactor behavior, and a system that had given the people inside the control room very little room for error. To understand what went wrong, we have to look at what was supposed to go right. The test scheduled for reactor number 4 on April 25, 1986 was designed to solve a dangerous safety gap. If the external power grid ever failed, the station's emergency diesel generators would take about 50 seconds to start up. In a high-powered nuclear reactor, 50 seconds without cooling water can easily lead to a core meltdown. Plant designers wanted to prove that the spinning, kinetic momentum of a coasting turbine generator could bridge this window, generating enough electricity to keep the vital water pumps running until backup power came online. Since the reactor was already scheduled for a routine maintenance shutdown, managers decided to run this experiment during the power descent, but unexpected grid demands delayed the test for 9 hours, pushing the execution deep into the night. At 11:10 p.m., the day shift handed operations over to the night crew, led by Supervisor Alexander Akimov and Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. This incoming team was expected to execute a highly specialized safety test, yet they had never received formal written instructions or proper training for this scenario. Instead, they had to rely on a draft procedure, stepping into a